Officer, before we continue, may I ask why I was stopped? The question came out calm, almost polite, but the silence that followed it was anything but. Because Officer Brandon Keller, standing on the shoulder of a desert highway outside Phoenix with every database showing clean, every document checking out, every single thing in order, couldn't answer her. And the longer he stood there, the more everyone watching understood exactly what kind of mistake had just been made. If this story made you stop scrolling, you're in the right place. Subscribe to our channel and follow every part of Haley Carter's story to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The afternoon heat on the I-17 corridor outside Phoenix was the kind that pressed down on everything on the asphalt, on the dry creosote scrub stretching flat in every direction, on the patience of anyone stuck inside a patrol car for the 5th hour of an 8-hour shift. Officer Brandon Keller had his window cracked just enough to let in the smell of scorched concrete and the distant diesel of a passing semi. His partner, Michael Hayes, was quiet the way he got. When he was tired, not sleepy tired, but bone tired, the kind that came from too many years watching young officers manufacture problems out of nothing. Hayes was 48. He had worked this stretch of highway long enough to remember when it was 2 lanes and when the biggest concern on a summer afternoon was a blown-out tire and a tourist from Ohio who'd underestimated the distance between gas stations. He wasn't cynical exactly. He was just done being surprised by people, which meant he'd also stopped being surprised when someone tried to make more of a traffic situation than it was. Keller was 33. He was not done being surprised by anything. He was still in the part of his career where his gut felt like information, where a hunch felt like evidence, where the picture he built in his head about someone in the first 3 seconds of seeing them felt, to him, as reliable as anything in any database. He had not yet learned, though he was about to, how catastrophically expensive that kind of confidence could be. He spotted the Ducati from a quarter-mile back. It was red, a Panigale V4. The kind of machine that didn't belong to anyone by accident. It was the result of either serious money or serious dedication or both, and it moved through traffic with the kind of fluid precision that told you the person on it wasn't just riding. They were communicating with the machine in a language most people never learned. It wasn't speeding. Keller clocked it at 61 in a 65 zone. It wasn't weaving. It wasn't cutting anyone off. The lane discipline was, objectively, better than most of what was around it. But Keller's eyes had already moved from the motorcycle to the rider, and the picture in his head had already started forming. A young woman, blonde hair visible at the edges of the helmet, gear that was worn in, not brand new, which should have told him something, but didn't, or rather, told him something it shouldn't have. A Ducati Panigale was not a beginner's machine. It was not something you bought as your first bike, unless you were either reckless or deeply inexperienced, and everything about the way this woman was riding suggested she was neither. But the picture in his head didn't include the riding. The picture in his head included the price tag on the machine and the person on top of it, and the two things in his mind didn't align. Panigale, he said out loud, almost to himself. Hayes looked up from the paperwork he'd been half-heartedly filling out. What? That Ducati. Panigale V4. You know what those run, Brandon? 45,000, depending on the build. That's a brand new car. That's more than a brand new car. Hayes set the paperwork down and looked at the motorcycle ahead of them. He looked at it the same way he looked at most things these days, carefully, without any rush to arrive at a conclusion. He watched it travel through a long curve with total control. He watched the brake light come on smooth, and even before the next interchange, not stabbed, not jerky, but the kind of braking that came from thousands of miles in the saddle. He said, "She's riding it clean." I know. Plate Keller had already run it. Registered to a Haley Marie Carter, Phoenix address. Current registration. No flags. So what are you thinking? I'm thinking something feels off. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he said very carefully, the way a man says something when he already knows it won't be heard. The plate is clean. The registration is valid. Let's not turn a feeling into a reason. But Keller had already reached for the lights. The moment the red and blue started flashing, Haley saw them in her mirrors. She didn't panic. She didn't accelerate. She didn't do any of the things a person does when they're guilty of something and trying to calculate their options. What she did was the same thing she always did when she needed to think clearly. She breathed out slow, let her shoulders drop, and moved through the sequence she'd rehearsed in her head 100 times because she'd grown up around enough people who'd been stopped on roadsides to know that how you handle the first 30 seconds determines almost everything that comes after. She signaled. She moved to the right. She found a wide shoulder and came to a complete, controlled stop. She put the kickstand down and sat still for a moment, engine running. Both hands where anyone watching could see them on the bars, and she waited. When the patrol car pulled in behind her and the officers got out, she reached forward and killed the engine. Then she removed her helmet slowly, set it on the tank in front of her, and combed one hand through her hair in a way that was not about vanity and entirely about giving two strangers with weapons an unobstructed view of her face. Keller was already walking toward her with the energy of a man who'd told himself a story and was now looking for evidence to confirm it. Hayes was a few steps behind, and if you knew how to read people, which Haley did, she'd been reading rooms since she was 9 years old in her father's garage. You could tell immediately that the two men were not on the same page. Keller reached her first. "Ma'am, I need to see your license, registration, and proof of insurance." Haley looked at him directly. Not combatively, just directly. The way you look at someone when you've decided you're not going to pretend you don't see what they're doing. "Of course," she said. "Before I reach into my jacket, I want to let you know that my license is in my left chest pocket. I'm going to reach for it now slowly." She did exactly that. "Registration and insurance are in the storage compartment under the seat. I'll need to get off the bike to access it." Keller nodded. She dismounted, opened the compartment, and pulled out a slim folder that had been sitting there clearly and deliberately, like someone who had placed it there specifically because they understood that a roadside stop was not the moment to be fumbling through random papers. She handed it all over. Keller took it without a word and walked back to the patrol car. Hayes stayed. He stood about 6 feet away, and he didn't say anything for a moment, just watched her with an expression that was harder to categorize than his partner's. There wasn't suspicion in it. There wasn't apology either. It was something closer to professional attention, the kind that doesn't assume anything yet, that's still gathering. "You ride often?" he asked. It was a conversational question, not an interrogation one. "Every day when I can," Haley said. "This is actually my work commute today. I had a repair call." "The Panigale's your work bike?" She almost smiled. "The Panigale is my personal bike, but it goes where I go." "You work on motorcycles?" "I own a motorcycle repair shop. Performance mechanic. I do a lot of track prep and custom engine work." Hayes nodded slowly. He looked at the Ducati with different eyes. Now not the eyes of a cop cataloging a suspicious asset, but something closer to actual interest. The bike was immaculate, but not in the showroom way. The immaculate of something that got used hard and was cared for harder. The kind of clean that didn't come from a valet service. "You do the maintenance on this one yourself?" "Every mile," she said. "I can tell you the service history from the moment I bought the engine." "When was that?" "About 3 years ago. I bought it as a rebuild project. Spent 14 months on the engine alone." Hayes was quiet again. And in that quiet, Keller came back. The databases had returned clean. All of them. Title history on the Ducati came back clean. The VIN matched. Her license was valid, no suspensions, no history that flagged anything. Her registration was current. Her insurance was active. On paper, on every piece of paper that existed in every system available to them, Haley Carter was exactly what she appeared to be, a licensed, insured rider on a legally owned, properly registered motorcycle, going about her day on a public highway without breaking a single rule. Keller handed the folder back to her, and then he said, "Do you own this motorcycle?" The question landed in the air between them. Hayes turned and looked at his partner. Not sharply, but he looked at him. Haley took the folder, She looked at the documents in Keller's hand that he'd just given back to her. Documents that answered the question he'd just asked. She said, "Yes, officer. The paperwork in your hand proves that. How long have you owned it?" 3 years since I started the rebuild. I took title 2 years ago when the restoration was complete. And you're telling me you rebuilt this engine yourself? I'm telling you I rebuilt this engine myself. That's a V4 engine. I know what engine is in my motorcycle. Something shifted in Keller's face. It was the shift that happens when a person realizes they've been challenged and interprets the challenge as a threat rather than a correction. His voice didn't get louder, but it got tighter. "I'm just trying to understand how someone—" He stopped himself. But not soon enough. Haley waited. "How someone what? Officer?" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. It hung there between them, that unfinished sentence. And it was more revealing than anything he could have said to complete it. "How someone like you. How someone your age. How someone who looks the way you look." The sentence didn't need an ending because everyone standing there could hear it perfectly well without one. Hayes heard it. Haley heard it. And something in Haley went very still. Not angry or not only angry. Something colder than anger. Something that had a clarity to it. The kind of clarity that comes when a situation you've half expected finally shows up and you realize you've been preparing for it without knowing you were preparing. "I worked for 12 years as a mechanic," she said. I started when I was 14 in my father's garage. I got my certification at 19. I opened my own shop at 23. The Ducati is mine, officer. Legally, financially, mechanically, in every way a thing can belong to a person, this motorcycle belongs to me." Keller said, "Can anyone confirm that?" The state of Arizona's DMV already confirmed it. You just read the confirmation. Hayes put his hand on his belt, not reaching for anything, just standing. He looked at the road for a moment. Then he looked back at his partner, and there was something in the look that Keller either didn't see or chose not to acknowledge. "I'd like to run the VIN one more time," Keller said. Hayes said quietly, "We already ran it. I'd like to run it again." That was when Haley noticed it, the moment she understood this stop was not going to resolve itself the way it should have resolved itself 15 minutes ago. Because a normal traffic stop, one motivated by actual legal concern, doesn't ask to run a VIN twice when the first result came back clean. A normal traffic stop doesn't ask a woman if she owns the vehicle she's driving after handing her the documents that prove she owns it. A normal traffic stop doesn't have one officer standing slightly to the side with the expression of a man watching a situation he can't quite stop. She didn't say any of this. Instead, she watched Keller walk back to the patrol car with her documents again, and she turned very slightly toward Hayes and said, quietly enough that it wasn't confrontational, "Am I being detained?" Hayes looked at her. "No, but I'm not free to go." He was honest. He said, "Give me a minute." She gave him a minute. She stood in the heat of the shoulder with the sun pressing flat and white and enormous on everything, and she used the time to do what she'd been doing since the moment the lights came on. She paid attention. She cataloged. She remembered. When Keller came back the second time, the VIN had come back clean again. Because it was going to come back clean every time he ran it. Because the motorcycle was not stolen. Because there was no crime here. Because the only thing that had brought them to this shoulder was a picture in one officer's head that the facts kept refusing to confirm. And that was when Keller's eyes traveled down the side of the Ducati and found the decal. It was not large. It wasn't meant to announce itself. It was a small patch-style sticker on the lower fairing, the kind you put on a machine that belongs to a community you're a part of. And the symbol on it was one that anyone who'd spent time around motorcycle culture would recognize immediately. The winged skull, the block letters, Hell's Angels. Keller's entire posture changed. It was a physical thing, visible to anyone watching. The way his shoulders squared. The way his chin came up slightly. The way his eyes moved from the sticker to Haley, with a new equation running behind them. As if the sticker had unlocked a room in his thinking that he was much more comfortable occupying than the one he'd been stuck in for the past 20 minutes. "Are you affiliated with the Hell's Angels?" he asked. And Haley was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds, she could have said one sentence, a single sentence that would have ended this entire situation within minutes. That would have sent Keller back to his patrol car with a different calculation in his head. That would have changed everything about how the next hour played out. She knew exactly what that sentence was. My father is Raymond Carter. He runs the local chapter. She didn't say it. Later, when people asked her why, she would give different pieces of the same answer. She would say she'd watched her father handle enough situations to know that invoking his name as a shield was exactly the kind of thing he'd raised her not to do. She would say she believed the law was supposed to protect her because she was right, not because of who she was related to. She would say she was 26 years old and she had earned every single thing she owned, and she was not going to stand on a public highway and use her father's reputation as a get-out-of-jail-free card when she hadn't done anything to need one. But part of it, the part she maybe didn't say out loud, but that shaped everything she did in the next hour, was something simpler and harder and more personal than any of that. She wanted to see what would happen if she was just herself. Just Haley Carter, mechanic, business owner, Ducati rider, woman on a public road who had broken no laws and owed no explanations beyond the ones she'd already given. She wanted to know if that was enough. She wanted to know because she needed to know. I know members of the Hells Angels community, she said. My father is involved. That sticker is on my bike because I'm proud of the people in my life who belong to that community. Is that relevant to why you stopped me? Keller said. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your affiliation. Am I being detained for a suspected crime? This is a routine inquiry. You ran my plate and it came back clean. You ran my VIN twice and it came back clean twice. My license, registration, and insurance are all valid. What crime are you investigating? Keller paused. Hayes had gone very quiet. Haley waited. I'd like to take a closer look at the vehicle, Keller said. Do you have probable cause for a search? Another pause. Longer this time. And in that pause, Haley did something that looked small but wasn't. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and she unlocked her phone. She didn't make any kind of show of it. She didn't point it at anyone or announce what she was doing. She just positioned it carefully and she started recording. Hayes noticed. He noticed and he said nothing because he knew the recording was appropriate. He knew that an officer who had stopped a woman with no legal justification and then refused to let her go and then asked to search her vehicle without cause was generating the kind of situation that a recording was specifically designed for. He knew all of this. He had known it, honestly, from approximately the moment the lights went on. The question he was wrestling with, the question that lived in the silence between him and his partner, and between him and everything he understood about what was right and what was happening, was what he was going to do about what he knew. 20 minutes later, they were still on the shoulder. Keller had asked to search the Ducati 3 times. 3 times Haley had asked him to articulate probable cause. 3 times he hadn't been able to. He'd called in a request for a canine unit, which was the kind of escalation that required documentation of reasonable suspicion, which he also hadn't been able to provide, which meant the request had come back uncertain, pending a supervisor call. Haley was sitting on the guardrail with her helmet on her knee. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't making calls. She wasn't showing any of the signs of distress or agitation that Keller, on some level, had been expecting, the signs that would have given him something to work with, something to point to, some behavior he could characterize as erratic or suspicious or indicative of anything at all. She was just sitting there, patient in a way that was almost unnerving, because it wasn't the patience of someone who was giving up or giving in. It was the patience of someone who had decided on a strategy and was executing it. Hayes came and stood near her. I want you to know, he said quietly, that I'm aware this stop should have been concluded 30 minutes ago. I appreciate you saying that, she said. I'm going to talk to my partner, okay? He walked back toward Keller, who was standing near the patrol car with his arms crossed and his phone out, looking at something. Hayes stopped 2 feet from him and said, in the voice of someone who'd been patient long enough, Brandon, we have no legal basis to hold this woman or this vehicle. The plate is clean. The VIN is clean. The documents are valid. She's invoked her rights correctly. I need you to tell me what we're doing here. Keller didn't look up from his phone. I have a feeling about this. That's not a legal standard. The Hells Angels connection is not a crime. Association with a motorcycle club is not a crime. Owning a sticker is not a crime. Hayes lowered his voice slightly. Brandon, she's recording us. And everything she's recorded is going to show a licensed rider on a legally owned motorcycle being held without cause. Is that what you want on your record? Keller finally looked up. Something moved across his face. Something complicated. Not remorse exactly. More like the first reluctant acknowledgement that the picture in his head and the situation in front of him were two completely different things, and that the distance between them was a problem he had created entirely by himself. He said, I want to wait for the supervisor. Fine, Hayes said. But when the supervisor arrives, they're going to ask the same question I just asked. And you need to have an answer that doesn't start with, I had a feeling. He walked back toward Haley. She was looking at the highway. Traffic moved past in both directions, trucks, sedans, a minivan with a cracked windshield, another motorcycle that slowed slightly as it passed the patrol car, and the woman sitting on the guardrail, and the Ducati sitting motionless on the shoulder. The rider of that motorcycle looked at her for a moment, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and they rode on. Is there someone you want to call? Hayes asked. I already sent a message, she said. To who? She looked at him calmly. Someone who should know what's happening. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your father? My father, she confirmed. He absorbed that. And your father is Raymond Carter, she said. Hayes had been on this highway long enough. He knew the name. He took a slow breath. Then he said, How long ago did you message him? About 25 minutes. Hayes looked down the highway in the direction that 25 minutes away would place someone coming from the Phoenix Metro. He did a quiet calculation, and something in his expression shifted, not fear, exactly, but the recalibration of a man who suddenly understood with complete clarity that the next few minutes were going to require very careful navigation and that his partner had absolutely no idea what was coming. He went back to Keller. Brandon, listen to me. Her father is Raymond Carter. Keller looked up. Hayes watched the name register, watched it travel across his partner's face and arrive somewhere in his understanding of the situation and expand there, changing the shape of everything it touched. The Raymond Carter. The Raymond Carter. A long silence. She could have told us that at the beginning, Keller said. But his voice was different now. The certainty had drained out of it. What remained was something smaller. She didn't, Hayes said. Think about why. Keller thought about it. And the answer he arrived at was uncomfortable, in a way he hadn't expected, because it reframed everything that had happened on this shoulder in the past 40 minutes. She hadn't used her father's name because she'd decided that her own name should have been enough. And the fact that her own name and her own documents and her own records and her own spotless history hadn't been enough was not her failure. It was his. He was still sitting with that when Hayes said, quietly and without drama, Here they come. Down the highway, coming from the north, 3 motorcycles, moving at legal speed, not rushing. The kind of approach that had nothing to prove, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because it already knew exactly what it was. The lead rider was Raymond Carter. And the stop that had started with a feeling in a young officer's gut was about to teach everyone present something that no feeling had ever been able to account for. That dignity, given enough time and the right person to carry it, makes itself impossible to ignore. Haley Carter stood up from the guardrail. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She just stood straight and let her father see that she was fine, that she was exactly who she'd always been, and that she had handled every single second of this afternoon on her own terms, which was, if you were paying attention, exactly what Raymond Carter had raised her to do. 3 motorcycles came to a stop behind the patrol car, and the highway went quieter in that particular way it does when something is about to shift, not louder, not more chaotic, just heavier, like the air before a storm decides what it wants to be. Raymond Carter cut his engine. He didn't rush getting off the bike. He didn't slam anything or raise his voice or make any of the dramatic entrances that a younger man in his position might have felt entitled to make. He was 55 years old, and he had learned somewhere in the long middle stretch of his life that the most powerful thing a person could do in a tense situation was move slowly and speak quietly and let the weight of what they represented do the work that noise never could. He unclipped his helmet and held it at his side, and he looked at his daughter. Haley was standing straight beside the guardrail. Her jacket was dusty from the shoulder, and her hair was still pressed flat from the helmet, and there was nothing in her expression that asked for rescue, which was the thing Raymond noticed. First, the absence of that particular look, the one that would have told him she'd lost ground. She hadn't. She was standing exactly the way he'd always hoped she would stand, like someone who knew the floor beneath her was solid because she'd built it herself. "You okay?" he said. "Fine," she said. "Been standing here about 45 minutes. Any reason for that?" "None that holds up legally." Raymond held her gaze for exactly one more second. Then he turned and looked at Officer Keller. Keller had not moved from where he was standing near the patrol car. Hayes had positioned himself a few feet away, which was its own kind of communication, close enough to be present, far enough to signal that whatever happened next was his partner's to own. Both of them knew the name Raymond Carter. Both of them understood what his arrival meant, not in terms of threat, because Raymond had brought no threat with him, but in terms of context. The context of who Haley Carter was and why her documents had always said exactly what they said, and why the only thing that had ever been suspicious about this stop was the reason it had started. Raymond walked toward them. He walked the way a man walks when he's decided in advance that he's going to be the most reasonable person in the conversation, which is a different kind of walk than confidence and a different kind again from aggression. It was deliberate, measured. The walk of someone who doesn't need to perform anything because the performance isn't the point. "I'm Raymond Carter," he said. "That's my daughter." "You want to tell me what's been happening out here?" Keller said. "Sir, your daughter was stopped for a routine." "Her plate was clean," Raymond said. Not loud, not cutting him off rudely, just stating a fact. "Her registration was current. Her insurance was active. Her VIN came back clean twice. She had every document in order." He paused. "That's not routine. That's a stop with no reason." "There were indicators." "What indicators?" Keller paused. And that pause was the loudest thing that had happened on that shoulder all afternoon. Raymond waited. He was good at waiting. He'd had a lot of practice. "A sticker," Hayes said quietly from where he was standing. He said it almost to himself, but everyone heard it. "The Hells Angels decal on the fairing." Raymond looked at Hayes for a moment. There was no anger in the look. There was something more complicated, a kind of exhausted recognition. The look of a man who has heard the same song so many times he can no longer muster surprise at it, only a deep and patient weariness. "A sticker," he repeated. "Yes, sir." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My daughter is a certified mechanic. She owns a business. She has no criminal record. She was on a legal road, on a legal motorcycle with legal paperwork, and she was stopped because someone decided something felt off." He looked at Keller. "Did I miss anything?" Keller said. "The situation required further investigation." "Into what?" Another pause. "Into what?" Raymond asked again, and his voice was still completely even, which was somehow more difficult to stand in front of than anger would have been. Keller said, "We were trying to establish." "You already established everything," Raymond said. "The system established it. The documents established it. My daughter established it. What you've been doing for the last 45 minutes isn't investigation. It's something else." He didn't name what the something else was. He didn't need to. Everyone standing on that shoulder knew exactly what it was. Hayes stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Carter, I want you to know that I've been aware since early in this stop that there was a problem with the legal basis for continuing it. I want that stated clearly." Raymond looked at him, nodded once. "I appreciate that. I haven't handled it as well as I should have." "No," Raymond said, "you haven't. But you're saying it now, which is something." He looked at Keller again. "Are you releasing my daughter's motorcycle?" Keller said, I've put in a request for a supervisor. Good, Raymond said. That's a good idea. He walked back to where Haley was standing, and he stood beside her, and the two members who'd come with him stayed near the motorcycles, quiet, watching, not doing anything that anyone could have objected to. They were just there, present. And their presence changed the texture of the moment in a way that had nothing to do with intimidation and everything to do with the simple human reality that when someone you care about is being treated unfairly, you go and stand with them. You show up. That's the first thing you do. Why didn't you use my name? Raymond asked quietly, close enough that only she could hear. Haley looked at him. You know why. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. I do. And something crossed his face that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite sadness and was maybe both at the same time. In the particular combination that parents carry when their child does exactly the right thing in a situation where they never should have had to. The supervisor arrived 17 minutes later. Sergeant Olivia Bennett drove a white patrol sedan, and she got out of it with the energy of someone who had been doing this job long enough to know exactly what kind of call she was walking into before she walked into it. She'd reviewed the dash cam footage on the way over. She'd looked at the call log. She'd seen the VIN check, the license check, the insurance check, the registration check, all of them clean, and the K-9 unit request, which had been flagged because no reasonable suspicion had been documented, and the tow request, which had been filed approximately 12 minutes before her phone rang, and which had made her drive faster. She was 51 years old. She had gray at her temples and reading glasses that lived in her shirt pocket, and she wore her authority. The same way Raymond Carter wore his, not as something that needed to be demonstrated, but as something that simply was. She looked at the situation. She cataloged it quickly. One Ducati motorcycle, unmoving, kickstand down, no visible damage, clearly operational. One young woman standing beside it composed, with her phone in her hand. One older man beside the young woman. 3 motorcycles behind the patrol car. 2 officers, one standing near the patrol car, with his arms crossed in the posture of a man who knew this next few minutes were going to be hard, and one standing slightly to the side, with the look of a man who'd been waiting for someone to come and do what he hadn't been able to make himself do. She walked to the patrol car first, not because she was avoiding anyone, but because she wanted to see the documentation before she asked any questions. She was in the car for 4 minutes. Those 4 minutes were quiet. Nobody talked much. One of the Hells Angels members, near the motorcycles, said something low to the other one, and both of them looked down the highway for a moment. Haley checked her phone, sent a brief message, put it back in her pocket. Raymond stood still with his arms at his sides. Hayes watched the patrol car. Keller watched Hayes watching the patrol car. Bennett came back out. She walked to Keller first, and she said something to him in a voice low enough that only he could hear, and whatever she said made him look at the asphalt for a moment before he looked back up. Then she walked toward Haley. She stopped in front of her and she said, Miss Carter, I'm Sergeant Olivia Bennett. I've reviewed the documentation and the stop log. I need to ask you a few questions, and I want to be straightforward with you. Based on what I've seen, I have significant concerns about how this stop has been handled. I appreciate that, Haley said. You've been on this shoulder for approximately 52 minutes. During that time, all database checks returned clean. No evidence of any crime was produced. A tow request was filed approximately 12 minutes ago. Can you tell me in your own words what happened from the moment you were stopped? Haley told her. She told her everything in the same calm, sequential way she'd been organizing it in her head for the past hour, not because she'd been building a case, but because she'd learned a long time ago that when you're right and the situation is wrong, the clearest thing you can do is stay in the facts and let the facts do the work. She told Bennett about the initial stop, about providing documents immediately, about the VIN being run twice, about being asked if she owned her own motorcycle after providing proof that she did, about being asked how someone her age could afford such an expensive machine, about the moment Keller saw the decal and the way everything changed when he did, about the search request, and the 3 times she'd asked for probable cause about the tow request. She said it all without raising her voice, without editorializing. She let the sequence of events carry its own weight. Bennett listened without interrupting. When Haley finished, Bennett said, "You said you've been recording. Since approximately 20 minutes into the stop." "Yes. I'd like to see that footage." "Of course." She handed her phone to Bennett. Bennett reviewed it. Whatever she saw, and she saw enough, anyone who watched those 20 minutes of footage would see enough. Her expression didn't change dramatically. It settled. The way a face settles when it receives confirmation of something it already suspected. She handed the phone back. "Thank you," she said. And then she turned and she walked directly to Keller. Everyone on the shoulder could see the conversation happening. They couldn't hear all of it, but they could see enough. They could see the moment Bennett asked her question, the specific question, the one that required an answer, and they could see Keller's response, and the pause before it, and the way Bennett's posture shifted when the pause went on longer than it should have. Haley looked at her father. "What do you think?" she asked him. Raymond said, "Same thing I asked him. Same thing Hayes asked him. What evidence did you have?" And he still doesn't have an answer," Raymond said. "Because there isn't one." Bennett came back. She stood in front of Haley and Raymond both, and she included both of them in what she said next, because it was relevant to both of them. "Miss Carter, I'm canceling the tow request. Your motorcycle is being released immediately. I'm also advising you that you have the right to file a formal complaint regarding the conduct of this stop, and I will personally document this incident for the department's internal review process." Haley said, "I want to be clear, I'm not doing this for consequences. I'm doing this so it doesn't happen to someone else." Bennett looked at her. Something in the sergeant's expression shifted, a slight recalibration, the kind that happens when you encounter someone who does something you respect. "I understand," she said. "And for what it's worth, I believe you," Raymond said. "The tow request, Sergeant, that's the part I need you to understand. That's not just bad judgment. That's escalation without cause. That's someone using the weight of the system to punish someone they couldn't legally stop. I understand that. Mr. Carter, do you understand that if my daughter hadn't had the presence of mind to record this, and the knowledge to know she didn't have to consent to a search, that motorcycle might be in an impound lot right now?" "Yes," Bennett said. "I do understand that. And that if she'd been 22 instead of 26, or if she'd been someone who didn't know her rights." "Yes," Bennett said again, and her voice had something in it now that was harder to categorize. Not defensiveness, not apology exactly. The kind of acknowledgement that costs something. "Yes, I understand." Raymond nodded. He didn't push further. He wasn't interested in making Bennett bleed. She wasn't the problem. She was, in fact, the part of the system working the way it was supposed to work, and he knew the difference between the two. Keller was standing near the patrol car. He had not come back over. Haley looked at him from a distance. He didn't look her way, and she thought about what it must feel like to be standing inside a mistake that big, to be standing in a situation where every system and every person and every piece of evidence had arranged itself to show you exactly where you went wrong and why. She thought about what it would require to look at that clearly. She wasn't sure Keller was there yet. She wasn't sure he was capable of it. But she thought about it. Hayes walked toward her. He stopped a respectful distance away, and he said, "Miss Carter, I want to say directly I knew earlier in this stop that it needed to end. I didn't push hard enough on that. I told myself I was managing it, giving it time to resolve, but the truth is I let it go on longer than it should have, because pushing back on my partner is uncomfortable, and I prioritized my own comfort over your rights. That's on me." Haley looked at him for a moment. "I appreciate that," she said. "I do. And I'm going to remember that you said it." She paused. "But I need you to understand something. You knew. You said yourself you knew. And for 52 minutes, someone who knew stood 3 feet away from what was happening and let it happen. Knowing isn't enough. Knowing requires something." Hayes took the words. He didn't deflect them or minimize them. He stood there and he took them, and the taking of them, the willingness to absorb rather than defend, was the one thing he'd managed to do right in the past hour. "You're right," he said. "You're completely right." "I know I am," she said. Not unkindly, just factually. She turned back to her motorcycle. She opened the storage compartment and plus the folder and closed it. She put her helmet on and fastened it and sat down and started the engine. And the Ducati came to life the way it always did immediately, cleanly, with that deep V4 note that rolled up through the chassis and into her hands and told her everything about the machine was exactly where she'd put it. She looked at her father. He was already back on his bike. He looked at her with that particular look, the one that had no name she'd ever found for it. That combination of love and worry and something fiercer than either. The look that had been watching over her since she was 9 years old, handing him tools in a garage and asking him what each one did and why. The look that had never once suggested she wasn't capable of handling whatever came at her. "Go ahead," he said. "I'm right behind you." She pulled out onto the highway. The Ducati moved through the gears smoothly, each shift clean and precise, and the distance between her and that stretch of shoulder grew quickly, and she kept her speed exactly at the limit because she understood with perfect clarity that the most powerful statement she could make right now was to be exactly who she had been for the past 52 minutes, a licensed legal rider on a road she had every right to use. Her phone, connected through the helmet's Bluetooth, buzzed with a notification. She waited until she was at highway speed, and then she let the voice reader tell her what it was. It was from a number she recognized but hadn't programmed someone in the riding community who monitored police scanner frequencies as a service to local riders. The message was 4 words. "It's already out there." Haley said nothing for a long moment, just rode, felt the machine and the road and the air moving over her and through her and the heat that was still pressing down, but felt different now, not oppressive the way it had felt on the shoulder, but just weather, just the world being what it was. Then she understood what the message meant. The scanner chatter had spread the way things spread in tight-knit communities fast, through channels that have been active for decades, through people who had long ago stopped expecting justice to announce itself and had developed their own infrastructure for tracking when it failed. By the time Haley had been on the highway for 20 minutes, 3 different riders in the Phoenix metro area had picked up the story. By the time she pulled into her neighborhood, it had reached the regional Hells Angels communication network, which was not a formal thing and not an informal thing, but something in between, a web of relationships and obligations and shared history that moved information the way water moves through limestone, quickly and without any single point of origin. Her phone was ringing by the time she killed the engine in her own driveway. The first call was from a woman named Carla Oates, who ran a riders' rights advocacy group out of Scottsdale and who had been documenting incidents of targeted motorcycle stops for 3 years. Carla had already heard a version of the story and wanted to know if Haley would be willing to speak to her formally. Haley said, "Give me an hour." The second call was from a man named Dennis Park, who was a civil rights attorney with an office in downtown Phoenix and who had done pro bono work for the Hells Angels, chapter twice in the past 8 years, and who had been passed Haley's number by someone he trusted. Dennis asked her 2 questions. The first was whether she'd recorded the stop. The second was whether she'd formally documented the incident with a supervising sergeant before leaving the scene. She said yes to both. "Good," Dennis said. "Don't post anything publicly until we talk. Can you come in tomorrow morning? 8 o'clock, she said. "I'll be there." The third call was from her father. He didn't say much. He asked if she'd gotten home safely. She said yes. He said, "You did everything right out there." She said she knew. He said, "I mean it, Haley. Everything." And his voice had something in it that she hadn't heard very often, that particular quality of a man who is proud of someone for a reason that has nothing to do with what they accomplished and everything to do with who they decided to be when the situation made it hard to be that. "I know, Dad," she said. "I'll talk to you tonight." She went inside and she sat down at her kitchen table and she set her phone face down in front of her. And she was quiet for a few minutes, not falling apart, not triumphant either, just sitting in the space that comes after something significant, that particular stillness when the adrenaline has metabolized and what's left is the reality of what happened and the reality of what comes next. She spent 52 minutes on a highway shoulder, being subjected to exactly the kind of stop she'd heard her whole life, the kind her father had warned her about without making her afraid of it, the kind that other riders in her community had described at clubhouse tables and roadside breakdowns and late-night parking lots, the kind that everybody who existed at a certain intersection of identity and visibility learned to prepare for. Not because they wanted to, but because preparation was the only rational response to a world that hadn't finished deciding what it thought of you. She had prepared. The preparation had worked. The preparation had worked because it had kept her clear when clarity was the thing the situation most needed, had kept her inside her rights when stepping outside them would have been both understandable and catastrophically costly, had kept her recording and documenting and asking the right questions at the right moments instead of giving Keller anything he could have used to reframe what was happening. And now the preparation was going to have to become something else, something bigger, something that moved beyond her own survival on that shoulder and turned into something that could actually protect the next person. She picked up her phone. She opened the contacts and found a name she hadn't texted. In several months, a woman named Joy Reyes, who taught motorcycle safety courses at a community center in Mesa and who had been trying for over a year to expand her curriculum to include riders' legal rights and police encounter protocols. Joy had asked Haley twice to come in as a guest speaker. Haley had been busy both times. She wasn't going to be too busy anymore. She typed, "I need to talk to you about the curriculum. I had something happen today. I want to help." Joy's response came in under 3 minutes. "I've been waiting for you to say that. Call me when you're ready." Haley set the phone down again. She thought about the 52 minutes. She thought about the young woman she might have been if she hadn't known what she knew, if she hadn't grown up with a father who believed that understanding your rights wasn't optional, and that the preparation for the moment you needed them had to happen long before the moment arrived. She thought about what would have happened if she'd been less certain, less composed, less equipped, if she'd raised her voice, if she'd refused a document check instead of providing everything cleanly and immediately, if she'd given Keller anything at all that he could have used to make his story about her instead of about his own assumptions. She thought about the Ducati sitting in impound, about someone with no Dennis Park in their contacts and no Raymond Carter 40 minutes away. About someone who didn't know that "am I being detained" was a question they had the right to ask. About someone who got into that car because nobody had told them they didn't have to. And about what happened to people who got into that car. Her jaw tightened. Not anger exactly. Something more functional than anger. The kind of feeling that doesn't waste itself on the situation that created it, but turns itself deliberately toward whatever comes next. She thought about what Officer Hayes had said. "I knew." She thought about what knowing required. She thought about the difference between a person who knew something was wrong and a person who acted on what they knew. And she thought about how the gap between those two things was exactly where most of the damage in most situations lived. Not in the people who were actively wrong. In the people who knew better and stayed quiet because staying quiet was easier. Hayes had called it his own failure. She'd accepted that. She meant what she'd said to him, that knowing required something more than itself, that knowing without action was its own kind of choice. But she also understood, sitting at her kitchen table with the heat of the afternoon finally beginning to lose its edge outside her window, that the same principle applied to her. To everyone who'd ever heard these stories and felt the burn of recognition and thought someone should do something about that and then gone back to whatever they were doing. Knowing required something. She knew. And starting tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock in Dennis Park's office, she was going to start figuring out exactly what that something needed to be. Outside, the desert was beginning its long, slow exhale into evening. The temperature would drop 50 degrees before midnight. The highway she'd on 3 hours ago was full of different cars now, different stories, different people, moving through the same stretch of asphalt with no idea what had happened there. That was always how it was. Life moved over the sites of its most important moments without marking them. The highway didn't know what had happened on its shoulder. The system that had stopped her didn't know yet what it had set in motion. But Haley Carter knew, and her phone was still buzzing. Dennis Park's office was the kind of place that told you everything about the man before he said a word, not because of how it looked, but because of what was in it. Case files stacked in a system only he understood. A whiteboard with 3 different colored markers and timelines that overlapped and crossed. A framed copy of the Fourth Amendment on the wall that wasn't decorative, that had handwritten notes in the margins, that had been there so long the ink had faded to the color of old grass. Haley sat across from his desk at 8:03 in the morning and put her phone on the table between them and said, "I want you to watch the whole thing before we talk." Dennis watched it. He didn't say anything during the footage. He was one of those people who went very still when he was paying close attention. The kind of stillness that wasn't passive but focused. The way a lens goes still when it's bringing something into sharp relief. He watched 52 minutes compressed through the portions she'd captured, and when it was over, he sat back and he picked up a pen and he tapped it once against his palm and said, "You asked for probable cause 3 times. 3 times, she confirmed. He never provided it. Never. The tow request was filed without documented reasonable suspicion. Bennett confirmed that when she arrived, she canceled it. Dennis wrote something. You have Bennett's name. Badge number, I have her card. Good. He wrote something else. The comment about how someone your age could afford the motorcycle, you want to tell me exactly how that was phrased. Haley told him. Verbatim. The way she'd kept it in her memory since the moment Keller said it, stored it in the part of her mind that didn't editorialize, just recorded. Dennis wrote it down without reacting. He was a man who dealt in language professionally, and he understood the weight of exact words versus approximate ones. Okay, he said. Here's what we have. We have a documented stop with no legal basis that persisted for 52 minutes past the point where all checks returned clean. We have a recorded admission from the second officer that the stop should have ended earlier. We have a supervisor who canceled the tow request and documented concerns. We have your recording. We have the dash cam, which I'm going to subpoena. He paused. And we have that comment. The comment that isn't on the recording, Haley said. No, but your testimony about it is evidence. And Hayes was standing there when it was said. I'm going to want to take his statement. Haley was quiet for a moment. I don't want to destroy Keller. Dennis looked at her over the pen. I know. I want this to change something. That's different. It is different, he said. And it's actually more useful legally, because what you're describing is a pattern issue, not a single bad actor issue. Pattern issues require systemic responses. Systemic responses require documentation. Documentation requires exactly what you walked in here with. He leaned forward slightly. You want this to matter beyond you. Then we build it to matter beyond you. That means we file the formal complaint with the department. We request the officer's stop history. How many stops resulted in searches? How many searches produced evidence of crime? Demographic breakdown. We put this into a record that can't be ignored. Haley said, How long does that take? Months, Dennis said. Possibly longer. He watched her absorb that. But Carla Oates has been building parallel documentation for 3 years. When we combine what she has with what you have, we're not asking the department to look at one incident. We're asking them to look at a pattern that one incident finally put a face on. Haley looked at the Fourth Amendment on his wall, at the handwritten notes she couldn't quite read from across the desk. My father wants to be more involved, she said. Your father's involvement needs to be carefully managed, Dennis said, not unkindly. Because the second the Hells Angels become the headline, the actual legal issue gets buried under the narrative that people already have ready. I know that's not fair. I know his community has rights the same as anyone, but I've seen cases collapse under that weight, and I don't want this one to. He'll understand that. Does he? Haley almost smiled. He's the one who told me not to use his name on the highway. He already understands it. Dennis sat back. He was quiet for a moment. And then he said something that Haley didn't expect. Why didn't you, by the way, use his name? It would have ended it in 5 minutes. She looked at the table for a second. Then she said, because I needed to know if I was enough. Not his daughter. Not someone with connections. Me. Just me and my documents and my rights. She paused. I needed to know if it was supposed to work. And it didn't, she said. Not until a supervisor showed up. Not until my father showed up. Not until there were witnesses and a recording and external pressure. She looked at him. That's the answer to your question. That's why I'm sitting in your office. Dennis held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, all right, let's build something. What they built over the next 3 weeks moved faster than Haley had expected, which surprised her because she'd spent her whole life watching things move slowly when they were supposed to move, and suddenly when they weren't supposed to, and she'd learned not to trust either. But this moved with a momentum that had its own logic, not because the system was suddenly working better than it had, but because the right pieces had arrived at the same moment. Carla Oates had her documentation. Dennis had Haley's recording and Bennett's preliminary report. And a journalist named Marcus Webb at the Arizona Republic had been sitting on a half-finished story about motorcycle profiling for 8 months, waiting for a case that was clean enough to lead with, that didn't have enough ambiguity for a department to hide behind. Haley's case was clean enough. Marcus called her on a Tuesday afternoon while she was elbow-deep in a carburetor rebuild. She had to wash her hands twice before she could touch the phone. He introduced himself briefly and said, I want to be straightforward with you about what I'm writing and what I'm not writing. I'm not writing a story about the Hells Angels. I'm not writing a story that makes Officer Kellel the villain of a crime narrative. I'm writing a story about a documented traffic stop with no legal basis that lasted nearly an hour and the policy questions that raises. You'd be the center of it. But the story is about the system. I know the difference, Haley said. I know you do. Your attorney told me. A pause. Can I ask you something off the record first? Ask. Why are you doing this publicly? You could have filed the complaint, let the internal process handle it, gone back to your life. Why the newspaper? Haley set down the part she'd been holding. She thought about the woman she'd imagined on the highway, the one without Dennis Park's number, without Raymond Carter 40 minutes away, without 14 years of watching her father navigate situations that required you to know exactly how much ground you were standing on. She thought about that woman standing on the shoulder, alone, with a tow truck on the way, and no recording and no knowledge of the questions she had the right to ask. Because the internal process works best when it has an audience, she said. And because the people who need to know they have these rights don't read departmental complaint files, Marcus said. Can I quote that? That one you can have on the record. The story ran on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, it had done the thing that stories about specific, documented injustices sometimes do when the documentation is airtight and the person at the center of it is undeniable. It traveled. Not viral in the meaningless sense, not the 24-hour flash of attention that leaves nothing behind. It traveled through the specific networks that carry things that matter to the people they matter to, the motorcycle community, the civil liberties community, the community of people who had been on roadsides like that one, and recognized the texture of what had happened with a recognition that came from their own bodies. Haley's phone did not stop for 3 days. She answered what she could. She forwarded what she couldn't to Dennis or Carla. She read the messages that came in from riders across Arizona and New Mexico and Nevada and as far away as Colorado and Tennessee. Messages that said some version of the same thing. This happened to me, and I didn't know I could do what you did, and I didn't know anyone would care if I did. That last part was the one that stayed with her. I didn't know anyone would care. She was sitting in her shop on a Saturday morning, surrounded by the machines she'd spent her adult life learning the language of, when Joy Reyes came through the door with 2 coffees and a yellow legal pad and said, Without preamble, I've had 11 people contact me since Thursday, asking if we offer the legal rights portion of the curriculum that the article mentioned. Haley looked up. The article mentioned it? Marcus included a line about you planning to work with safety programs. Did he not tell you that? He told me he might. Joy set the coffees down and pulled up a stool and said, so we need to actually have it to offer, which means we need to build it, which means I need you to commit to 4 sessions, 2 in Mesa, 1 in Glendale, 1 here, and I need a curriculum outline by the end of the month. Haley picked up one of the coffees. You always work this fast? I work exactly as fast as the situation requires, Joy said. The situation currently requires this fast. She opened the legal pad. Here's what I'm thinking for structure. They worked for 2 hours at the work table in the back of the shop, between a partially dismantled Harley Sportster and a wall of tools, organized with the obsessive precision of someone who spent their professional life understanding that the right tool in the wrong position caused failures that looked like mechanical problems but were actually human ones. Joy had been teaching safety courses for 6 years, and she understood curriculum in the way Haley understood engines, not as a set of procedures to be followed, but as a system with its own internal logic, where each part needed to understand its relationship to every other part or the whole thing broke down. What they built in those 2 hours was the skeleton of something that would take months to flesh out fully, but the skeleton was solid. How to organize documentation before you ever needed it. What you are and are not legally required to provide during a stop, and the difference between compliance and consent. The specific language of invoking rights without escalation. What to do when an officer doesn't respond correctly to a rights invocation. How to document a stop in real time. Who to call and in what order. How to find legal resources if you can't afford them. This last section, Joy said, tapping the legal pad. Resources. I want real contacts, not a generic hotline number that leads to a wait time. Dennis will give us a referral list, Haley said. And Carla's organization does direct intake. We can structure it so if someone comes out of one of these sessions and gets stopped the next week, there's an actual human being they can reach. Joy wrote that down. Then she said, without looking up from the pad, the department issued a statement. Haley had seen it. 2 sentences buried in the 4th paragraph of a follow-up article, something about the department taking all complaints seriously and conducting thorough reviews of officer conduct. The language of managed distance. The language of an institution deciding how much ground it was willing to give before it needed to hold the line. I know, Haley said. It's not enough, I know that too. Joy looked up. Is it going to get to enough? Haley thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved. She thought about Dennis and his timeline of months, possibly longer. She thought about the stop history, request, and the demographic breakdown, and the pattern documentation that Carla had been building for 3 years. She thought about what it took to move something that had weight behind it, not just the weight of one incident. One recording, one clean-cut case that the newspaper found compelling, but the weight of all the incidents that didn't have recordings and all the stops that didn't generate complaints because the person stopped didn't know they could file one or didn't believe it would make any difference. I think it gets to better, she said finally. Better than it was. Whether it gets to enough depends on whether enough people decide they're done with better and they want actual enough. Joy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's a very honest answer. You asked an honest question. The thing that happened next was the thing nobody in the story had anticipated. Not Haley, not Dennis, not Carla Oates, not Marcus Webb. It came from the direction no one had been watching. It came from Michael Hayes. 3 weeks after the article ran, Hayes submitted a written statement to the department's internal affairs office that went beyond what had been asked of him. It wasn't the statement of a man covering himself. It wasn't careful language designed to protect his record while appearing cooperative. It was the statement of a man who had spent 3 weeks sitting with what Haley had said to him on the highway shoulder, knowing requires something, and who had arrived, slowly and not without cost, at what that something was for him specifically. He documented the stop in full from his perspective. He documented the moment he knew the stop lacked legal basis. He documented the specific times he raised the issue with Keller and the specific responses he received. He documented his own reasoning for not escalating further sooner, the discomfort of challenging a partner, the institutional culture that made that discomfort feel like wisdom rather than avoidance. The way the training he'd received had given him language for why stops were justified, but not language for how to effectively challenge one that wasn't. He described that gap between what he knew was right and the tools he had to act on it as a structural problem, not a personal one. And he asked, at the end of the statement, for the department to examine that gap specifically. Dennis called Haley on a Tuesday evening to tell her. She was in her shop. She had a flashlight in one hand and a torque wrench in the other, and she set them both down when he told her what Hayes had written. She was quiet for a long moment. He didn't have to do that, she said. No, Dennis said. He very much did not have to do that. He's going to take damage for it. Probably some. Hard to say how much. The statement is careful. He's honest about what he did. Wrong without accusing his partner of anything that isn't documented. But yes, there are people in that department who are going to treat this as a betrayal. Haley thought about Hayes standing on the highway shoulder saying, I knew. She thought about the gap between knowing and acting that she'd spoken to him about, and she thought about the version of Hayes that had let 52 minutes happen. And then she thought about this version of Hayes sitting at a desk 3 weeks later and deciding that knowing was no longer sufficient and that the something it required was a written statement that he didn't have to write, and that was going to cost him something, and that he wrote anyway. Is his statement going to matter? She asked. To the internal investigation? Yes, significantly, because it closes a hole that Keller's account might have tried to use the idea that Hayes shared his assessment of the stop's validity and found it justified. This removes that as a possibility. Dennis paused. And it changes the story about what kind of department this is. One statement from a sergeant canceling a tow isn't enough to make a department look at itself, but a written statement from the partner who was there, who documents a cultural problem rather than just an individual one that's harder to manage. Haley let out a slow breath. Does he know I know? Not yet. I wanted to ask you if you wanted to reach out. She thought about it. Then she said, give me his contact. She texted Hayes that night. She kept it short because she thought short was what the moment required, not the absence of something. But the precision of it, the same precision she brought to a torque spec, the understanding that too much in either direction caused a different kind of failure. She wrote, I heard what you did. It matters. Thank you for deciding that knowing was enough reason to act. He didn't respond that night. He responded the next morning, early enough that she figured he hadn't slept well. He wrote, you told me what knowing required. I just finally listened. I hope it helps. She read it twice. Then she put the phone in her pocket and walked out to her shop and started the day's first job, which was a valve adjustment on a 2019 Road King that had come in the previous afternoon. And she worked in the silence of early morning with her hands and her tools and the particular quality of focus that the work required. And she thought about what it's meant that the most significant move in the past 3 weeks had come from someone she'd spent 52 minutes on a highway shoulder watching fail to do the right thing. She thought about the gap Hayes had described in his statement, the gap between knowing something was wrong and having the tools and the institutional support to act on it. She thought about that gap not as an excuse, because it wasn't one, but as a real thing that real people fell into, and about what it would take to build something across that gap that people could actually walk on. Not just riders who needed to know their rights. Officers who needed something more than training in how to justify stops. A different kind of preparation for a different kind of gap. That thought was still with her when Carla Oates called at noon. Carla had been in contact with a city council member named Patricia Webb, no relation to the journalist, who had been watching the incident's trajectory for 3 weeks and who had asked Carla if Haley would be willing to speak at a public council session in 6 weeks. As part of a broader discussion, the council was beginning about community police relations and department accountability protocols. A council session, Haley said. Not testimony, Carla said. A community input session. You're not a plaintiff in that room. You're a constituent with direct documented experience of a policy failure. And the council has created a space to hear that. How many people in the room? It's public. Could be 20. Could be 200. Could be more if the article has done what I think it's done. Haley thought about the 11 people who'd contacted Joy in 3 days. She thought about Marcus Webb's story, traveling through networks that carried things that mattered to the people they mattered to. She thought about the messages from writers in Tennessee and Colorado who'd said, I didn't know anyone would care. I'll do it, she said. I'll send you the date, Carla. She paused. This council session, are they actually going to do something? Or is this one of those things where a room full of people speak and then the file gets put in a drawer? Carla was quiet for a moment. She was honest because she was always honest. I don't know, she said. It depends on how many people show up. It depends on the recording Hayes submitted. It depends on whether Dennis's stop history request turns up what we think it's going to turn up. It depends on a lot of things that are currently in motion. Another pause. But I've been doing this for 3 years, and this is the closest I've seen to enough pieces being in the same place at the same time. I don't know if it becomes enough, but I know it's further than it's ever gotten. Haley absorbed that. Okay, she said. 6 weeks. I'll be there. She hung up and stood in her shop for a moment with the phone in her hand and the Road King half assembled on the lift in front of her. She thought about Keller. She hadn't heard about him directly in 3 weeks, only through the institutional language of the department statement and the peripheral information that Dennis had shared about the internal investigation scope. She didn't know what was happening inside. Whatever room Keller was sitting in, what the investigation had asked him, what he'd said, whether any of it had reached him in the way that things need to reach people to actually change something. She thought about the moment on the highway when he'd looked at the asphalt. That moment when the gap between the picture in his head and the reality in front of him had become, briefly, too wide to bridge with anything he had available. She didn't know what he'd done with that moment in the 3 weeks since. She didn't know if he'd built something from it, or walled it off, or found some third thing that let him hold it without it changing him. She didn't know if he was capable of what Hayes had been capable of. She thought she probably needed to stop trying to calculate it. That particular unknowable was his to carry, not hers. Her job was the curriculum and the council session and the conversation with Joy and the phone calls from writers who needed to know that their rights were real and that someone would show up to stand beside them if they needed it. Her job was the thing she'd already decided on a kitchen table 2 days after the stop. Knowing required something, and she knew, and so she had to build the something. She put the phone in her pocket. She picked up the torque wrench. She went back to work. What Haley didn't know yet, what nobody knew yet, because the information was still inside the walls of an institution that moved on its own timeline, regardless of how many articles had been written or how many phones had buzzed or how many writers in Tennessee had sent messages that said, I didn't. No anyone would care was what Keller's stop history had actually contained. Dennis got the records on a Friday afternoon. He called Haley immediately. She was at Joy's Community Center in Mesa, standing in front of 17 people who'd come to the first session of the curriculum they'd built together, and she saw Dennis's name on her phone, and she said to the group, "Give me 2 minutes," and stepped into the hallway. "Tell me," she said. "In the past 18 months," Dennis said, and his voice had the careful flatness of someone delivering information they want to land clearly and without distortion. Keller conducted 47 stops of motorcycle operators. 31 of those stops resulted in some request to search the vehicle. Of those 31 search requests, 22 were declined by the operator. Of the 22 operators who declined, 14 were women. Of the 14 women who declined, 11 were women under 35. Haley said nothing. Of the 47 stops, Dennis continued, 6 resulted in any finding of actual legal violation. 6 out of 47. And 3 of those 6 were equipment violations: a broken taillight, an expired plate sticker, a missing mirror. Not theft, not contraband, a taillight. The hallway was very quiet. "He was doing this before me," Haley said. "It wasn't a question. Long before you." Stop number 48. She leaned against the wall. She thought about 47 other people on 47 other highway shoulders. She thought about the ones who'd given consent they didn't know they could withhold. She thought about the 14 women and the 11 of them under 35, and whether any of them had recordings, and whether any of them had Dennis Parks, and whether any of them were currently standing in a community center hallway being told that what happened to them was part of a documented pattern that nobody had been looking at because nobody had been looking. "Are you filing?" she asked. "Monday morning. With everything. The stop history. Your recording. Hayes' statement. Bennett's report." A pause. "Haley, this is no longer just about your stop. This is a pattern claim. The legal exposure for the department is significant." "How significant?" "Significant enough that I expect to hear from the city attorney's office by Wednesday." She stood in the hallway for another moment. She thought about the council session in 6 weeks. She thought about Carla saying, "This is the closest I've seen to enough pieces being in the same place at the same time." She thought about the 17 people on the other side of the door who'd come to learn what she hadn't known how to do 4 weeks ago, which was to turn what she knew into something that could protect the next person. She said, "Do what you need to do." "I will," he said. "Go back to your session." She walked back through the door. 17 people looked at her. She stood in front of them and she took a breath and she said, "Sorry about that. Where were we?" A woman in the second row, 50s, leather jacket, silver braid down her back, said, "You were about to tell us what to say when they ask for consent to search." "Right," Haley said. "Right. So here's the thing about that question. It sounds like a formality, but it's not. It's a legal threshold. And the answer you give in the next 3 seconds determines everything that comes after it." She looked at the room. At 17 people who had come on a Saturday morning to learn something they should never have had to learn, but needed to know. At 17 people who were, each of them, one traffic stop away from needing exactly this. "So let's get it exactly right," she said. And she began. The city attorney's office called Dennis Park on Wednesday at 9:47 in the morning, which meant they'd spent Monday and Tuesday doing exactly what Dennis had expected them to do, reading the file, running the numbers, consulting with whoever they consulted with, when a pattern claim landed on their desk, with Forda CFN documented stops and a recording that left no interpretive room and a sworn internal statement from a partner officer that closed every door an institution might otherwise try to walk through. The call lasted 22 minutes. Dennis called Haley at 10:14. She was in her shop. She had a customer's bike on the lift and a diagnostic readout on her laptop and a coffee going cold on the corner of the workbench, which was where her coffee always ended up, started hot, abandoned the moment the work got interesting, remembered when it was too late to matter. She saw his name and picked up immediately. "They want to talk," Dennis said. "Define talk." "Formal meeting, city attorney, department legal counsel, a representative from the chief's office. They want to sit down and discuss resolution." Haley set down the diagnostic tool. "How fast?" They proposed Friday. "That's 2 days, he confirmed, which tells you something about how they're reading the file. She thought about what it meant that an institution that had issued a 2-sentence statement 3 weeks ago now wanted a formal meeting in 48 hours. She thought about 47 stops and 31 search requests and 11 women under 35. And she thought about whatever calculation the city attorney had run when those numbers landed in front of them. The calculation that happened when documented pattern met legal exposure, met a recording that had already been published in a newspaper and was therefore not something that could be made to disappear. "What do they want?" she asked. "They haven't specified terms yet. That's what the meeting is for. But the fact that they're moving this fast tells me they want this resolved without litigation." He paused. "Which means they need something from you that you have, and they don't." "My agreement not to sue." your agreement not to sue, and possibly your cooperation on how the resolution is framed publicly. Haley was quiet for a moment. She looked at the bike on the lift. She thought about the 17 people in the Mesa Community Center and the curriculum outline on Joy's legal pad and the council session in 6 weeks and the 46 other stops that didn't have recordings and the operators who had. Given consent, they didn't know they could withhold. She thought about what she'd told Dennis on the first morning in his office. I want this to change something. I'll be there Friday, she said. But Dennis, I need you to understand what I'm walking in there for. I'm not walking in for a settlement check. I'm walking in for something structural, something that changes the training, something that addresses the stop history, not just my stop. I know, he said. Do they know that? They're about to. Friday morning came with the specific quality of stillness that precedes things that matter, the kind of stillness Haley had learned to recognize over the years, not the absence of noise, but the presence of weight, the air before something tips. She drove to Dennis's office first. They reviewed the documentation together for 40 minutes. He walked her through the meeting structure, who would be in the room, what each person's role and interest was, what she could expect them to offer, and what she should not accept. They're going to lead with an apology, Dennis said. It'll be carefully worded. It'll acknowledge that the stop fell below departmental standards without admitting specific legal liability. Don't react to it either way. Let me handle the legal framing. What do I handle? The substance. What you actually want. You say it clearly, you say it once. And then you let me negotiate the mechanism. He looked at her. You know what you want? I've known since the highway shoulder. He almost smiled. Then we're ready. The meeting room was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like recycled air, and the particular institutional neutrality of places where uncomfortable things get decided. There were 6 people on the other side of the table when Haley and Dennis walked in. The city attorney was a compact woman named Rachel Voss, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the expression of someone who had sat in difficult rooms for a long time and had developed a productive relationship with difficulty. The department's legal counsel was a man named Gregory Firth, who was younger than Haley expected and who had a legal pad already covered in handwriting. The chief's representative was a deputy chief named Warren Aldous, 50-something, who looked at Haley when she came in the room with an expression she couldn't immediately read. They introduced themselves. They sat down. Rachel Voss said, "Without preamble, Miss Carter, on behalf of the city, I want to acknowledge that the stop you experienced on Route 17 did not reflect the standards we hold our officers to. That's the beginning of this conversation, not the end of it." Haley said, "I appreciate that. We've reviewed the recording, the internal documentation, Officer Hayes' statement, and the stop history data your attorney requested. We understand the scope of what we're looking at." Dennis said, "Then you understand this conversation is about more than one stop." "We do," Voss said. Aldous said, "Miss Carter, I want to be direct with you. The stop history data, the 47 stops, the search request pattern, that's something we have to not address regardless of this meeting. That's a departmental issue that exists independent of your specific situation." Haley looked at him. "Then why hasn't it been addressed?" The question landed flat and clean. Aldous didn't flinch from it, because nobody had compiled it in a form that required a response until your attorney's request made it visible. So it required someone to be stopped on a highway shoulder for 52 minutes without legal cause for the data to become visible. "Yes," Aldous said, "that's accurate." The room was quiet for a moment. "That's what I want to change," Haley said. "Not the fact that it happened to me. The fact that it takes an individual incident to make a pattern visible. I want a monitoring mechanism. I want stop data reviewed quarterly, broken down by operator demographics, with a threshold that triggers automatic supervisory review. I want it built into policy, not left to individual complaint filings." Voss and Firth exchanged a look. "That's a significant operational ask," Firth said. "It's a data management system," Haley said. "You already have the data. You just need a protocol for looking at it on a schedule instead of waiting for someone to force you to." She paused. which is not a significant operational ask. It's a basic accountability function, Dennis said. We're also asking for a revised training module on the legal standards for extending a stop past the initial justification. Specifically, what constitutes documented reasonable suspicion versus officer intuition. Officer Hayes' statement identifies a gap in training on this point. The department has acknowledged the statement. We'd like the gap addressed formally. Aldous said, the chief has already ordered a training review. We'd like that review to include community input, Dennis said. Specifically, input from organizations that have documented motorcycle stop patterns. Carla Oates' organization has 3 years of data. It should be in the room. Another exchange of looks across the table. Firth wrote something on the legal pad. Voss said, and in terms of individual resolution regarding Officer Keller specifically. Haley said, I'm not asking for his termination. That surprised them. She could see it, the slight recalibration across multiple faces, the adjustment of an expectation that had been sitting ready to be deployed. She let the surprise settle before she continued. What happened on that highway was wrong. What the stop history shows is a pattern that caused harm to people who mostly didn't have what I had documentation, legal support, knowledge of their rights. That's on the officer, and it's on the training, and it's on the supervision that should have been reviewing that data on a schedule. All 3 of those things need to change. She paused. But my goal here is not to destroy someone. My goal is to change something. If Keller goes through a meaningful accountability process and a retraining and demonstrates that something has actually changed, that serves my purpose better than termination does. Because termination sends him somewhere else. Accountability changes what happens here. The room was quieter than it had been. Aldous looked at her with the expression she hadn't been able to read when she walked in, and now she could read it. It was the look of someone encountering a position they had not predicted and finding themselves up against their professional caution moved by it. That's a thoughtful position, he said. I had 52 minutes on a highway shoulder to think about what I actually wanted, she said. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. When Haley and Dennis walked out, they had not resolved everything. These things didn't resolve in single rooms, in single mornings. What they had was a framework, a documented framework, witnessed and recorded, that committed the department to specific actions on a specific timeline. The quarterly data review with demographic breakdown. The training module revision with community input. A formal acknowledgement of the stop's lack of legal basis in Haley's record. An internal accountability process for Keller that was documented and reviewable, not handled quietly in a personnel file that nobody could access. And one more thing. The thing that had come up in the last 20 minutes of the meeting, proposed not by Dennis and not by Voss, but by Aldous himself, which was the thing that told Haley something she hadn't known for certain until that moment, that there were people inside the institution who had been waiting for a moment like this one, who had been sitting with the knowledge that something needed to change and without the mechanism to force it into visibility. Aldous had said, we'd like to explore a community liaison program. Rider community representatives who can bring documented concerns directly to a supervisory contact on a quarterly basis. Not a complaint system, something upstream of complaints. A relationship. Haley had looked at him. He'd said, I'm aware this is the city asking for something from the community. It failed. I'm aware that's an uncomfortable position to ask from. But I think it's the right structure. She'd said, I'll talk to my father. Which was how, on a Thursday evening 2 weeks later, Raymond Carter sat in a conference room in the same building Haley had been in, drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup and looking at Deputy Chief Warren Aldous across a table, with Carla Oates and Joy Reyes and a Hells Angels chapter officer named Deke Morrison and 2 representatives from a sport bike club in Tempe, all sitting around the same table, talking about what a rider liaison program would actually need to look like to function as something more than a gesture. Raymond had dressed the same way he always dressed. He'd not adjusted anything about himself for the room. He sat straight and he listened more than he talked. And when he talked, it was with the same deliberate economy he'd used on the highway shoulder. Not the economy of someone who had nothing to say, but the economy of someone who understood that in a room like this one, the weight of words mattered, and he wasn't going to waste any. At one point, Aldous said, "Mr. Carter, I want to ask you something directly. And I want to be clear that it's a genuine question, not a political one." Raymond said, "Ask. How do we build trust in a community that has spent decades being told that the institution doesn't want their trust?" Raymond was quiet for a moment. He looked at the coffee cup. He said, "You show up. Consistently. Not when there's a crisis and you need something. Not when someone has a recording and an attorney and the situation has become expensive." He looked at Aldous. "You show up when nothing's on fire. You show up when it's inconvenient. You show up when showing up doesn't benefit you in any visible way. You do that long enough and consistently enough, and the trust isn't given, because trust isn't something that gets handed over. It gets built, slow, and with a lot of weight bearing before anyone tests it." He paused. "That's how I built what I have in my community. I showed up when people needed it, every time, without keeping score. You want to know how to build trust? Stop keeping score." Aldous wrote that down, not on a legal pad, on a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. He wrote it down with the kind of attention that said it wasn't going into the record. It was going somewhere more personal than that. Haley watched from across the room and thought about the 9-year-old version of herself in a garage, handing her father tools and watching how he was with people, how he listened with his whole body, how he never made someone feel small for not knowing something, how he understood that the people who came to him in the worst moments of their day needed not just the mechanical problem solved, but the experience of being treated like someone who's worth solving carefully and completely. She thought about how that quality had shaped everything she'd become. And she thought about how it was sitting in a government conference room right now, being asked to help build something that might, if enough people in that room were serious, if enough of the right people stayed in their positions long enough for the framework to become practice, if the quarterly reviews actually happened and the data actually got looked at and the training actually changed it, might mean that the next woman on the next highway shoulder had a different 52 minutes than she'd had. Might. She'd stop pretending she could guarantee more than might. But might was more than it had been 6 weeks ago. That mattered. The council session happened on a Tuesday evening in a room that fit 200 people and held, by the fire marshal's count, 237, with more standing in the corridor outside with the doors open. Haley had not expected that. Joy had told her the article had done what she thought it had done, and Carla had said it was the closest she'd seen to enough pieces in the same place at the same time, but 237 people on a Tuesday evening was a different category of thing than Haley had let herself picture. She sat in the front row with Dennis on one side and her father on the other, while 4 other community members spoke before her turn came. She listened to each of them the way she listened to everything fully, without preparing her own response while they were still talking, with the understanding that what they were saying was the context for what she was going to say, and that if she didn't actually hear it, she was going to stand up there and give a speech instead of a testimony, and a speech was exactly what this room didn't need. What she heard was 40 years of a woman named Geraldine, who'd had 3 sons, stopped on motorcycles and knew the statistics on what happened after stops that went wrong, and had spent 3 years attending council sessions with documented incidents and being told the data was insufficient. What she heard was a 29-year-old sport bike rider named Tomas, who'd had his motorcycle impounded on a suspicion that was cleared within 40 minutes, but whose bike had sat in impound for 11 days because of a processing backlog, costing him money he'd been saving for 3 months. What she heard was Deke Morrison from the Hells Angels chapter, talking about riders who'd stopped coming to the department with problems, not just traffic problems, actual crime problems, things they should have been able to report because the accumulated experience of the community had taught them that the institution wasn't a safe place to take their problems. When her turn came, Haley stood at the podium and looked at the room, and she didn't start with her own story. She started with what she'd heard. Geraldine has been in this room for 3 years, she said. Tomas lost 11 days of transportation to an impound that was cleared in 40 minutes. Deke is talking about a community that has stopped using the systems it should be able to use. That's the context for what I'm going to say. My stop is one data point. What you're hearing in this room tonight is a pattern. And a pattern is what requires a systemic response. She talked for 12 minutes. She didn't go over. She'd practiced the timing because she understood that discipline in a public forum was its own kind of credibility, that the person who takes 12 minutes when they were given 12 minutes demonstrates a different relationship with authority than the person who takes 22. She covered the stop, the data, the framework from the meeting with the city attorney, and what she was asking the council to do: vote to formalize the quarterly review protocol as a municipal policy requirement rather than a departmental discretionary procedure, which was the difference between something that happened until a chief decided it didn't need to happen anymore and something that happened because the law said it happened. When she finished, the room was not quiet. It was the specific kind of loud that comes when 237 people decide simultaneously that they've been holding something and can now put it down. The council member who chaired the session, a man named Jerome Gates, who had the expression of someone genuinely trying to hold the gravity of the moment without being swept into theater, asked her 3 questions. Specific, substantive questions, not the kind designed to fill time, but the kind designed to understand. She answered each one directly. Then the session opened to public comment. It ran for an hour and 40 minutes. Haley sat in the front row and listened to every word. What happened afterward happened in the parking lot, which was where the meeting had continued unofficially. The way important conversations always continue past the official room and into whatever space follows it: the parking lot, the sidewalk, the diner 2 blocks over, the places where the formality drops and people say the things they actually mean. Haley was talking to Geraldine when she saw him. Keller was standing at the edge of the parking lot, not in uniform. In jeans and a dark jacket, standing the way a man stands when he's gone somewhere. He wasn't sure he had the right to go and is waiting to see whether his presence is going to be acceptable or a problem. He was alone. He wasn't approaching anyone. He was just there, watching the people from the meeting move through the parking lot, watching Haley specifically with an expression she couldn't fully read from the distance. She said to Geraldine, "Give me a minute," and walked toward him. He straightened slightly when he saw her coming. He put his hands in his jacket pockets, which was the body language of someone trying to occupy less space. She stopped about 4 feet from him, which was close enough to talk without broadcasting conversation to the parking lot. "I didn't expect you here," she said. "I wasn't sure I should come," he said. "But you did." I watched the whole session from the back. His voice was different from the voice she remembered on the highway. That voice had been tight with certainty. This one had something looser in it, something that cost more to produce. "I heard what you said about the 47 stops. You knew the number?" "The internal investigation shared it with me." He was quiet for a moment. "I knew I'd stopped a lot of motorcycles. I told myself I had reasons for each one. Sitting in that room tonight and hearing it as a number, hearing it the way you said it, I don't know. It was different." Haley looked at him. She thought about what she'd told the city attorney's office. "I'm not asking for his termination. What happened on that highway was wrong." She thought about the gap between being wrong and knowing you're wrong, and the longer, harder gap between knowing you're wrong and actually changing. She wasn't in a position to know which gap Keller was standing in. Nobody was. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But he had come. He had come on a Tuesday night, not in uniform, to sit in the back of a room he didn't have to be in and listen to the consequences of his own pattern. And that was something. Not enough. Not close to enough. But something. "What do you want me to tell you?" she asked. He thought about it. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I came because I thought I should hear it. What was said in there, from the people it affected." A pause. "I don't know if that matters." "It's a start," she said. Whether it becomes more than a start, that's yours to figure out. He nodded. Slowly, like someone filing something away in a place they intended to return to. The training review, he said. Hayes told me about the module revision. The community input. He looked at her. I've been asked to participate, to describe from my own experience where the training failed, where it left gaps. I didn't know if he stopped. If I'd what? If you'd want that. Someone like me in that room. Haley thought about what Aldous had said. I'm aware this is the city asking for something from the community. It failed. She thought about showing up. She thought about the gap between where a person had been and where a process needed them to go, and whether the process had room for both. Someone like you is exactly who needs to be in that room, she said. Because the training doesn't change if the only people changing it are the ones who got everything right. It changes when the people who got it wrong are honest about how and why. She paused. Can you be honest about that? He held her gaze. I'm trying to be, then be in the room. She walked back to where Geraldine was waiting. Geraldine looked at her, and then looked at the man still standing at the edge of the parking lot, and then looked back at Haley with the kind of look that had the whole question in it without needing any of the words. He came, Haley said. I see that, Geraldine said. Doesn't fix anything. No, Geraldine said. But it's the right direction. They stood together in the parking lot for another moment. Around them, the 237 people were spreading out into the city, carrying the weight of what had been said in that room, some of them toward conversations, some of them toward nothing more than their own thoughts on the drive home, some of them carrying specific pieces of the evening that would sit with them for weeks before they understood what they needed to do with them. Raymond came and stood beside his daughter. He'd been working the room for the last 20 minutes with the same quiet effectiveness he brought to everything, not collecting, not performing, just being present in a way that made people feel that someone serious was paying attention, and that serious attention from someone you trusted was one of the more valuable things in any difficult situation. He said, Good session, she agreed. Jerome Gates wants a follow-up meeting, specifically about the liaison program and whether the council can support it with a formal resolution. When? He said he'd reach out to Dennis. Raymond paused. He also said something else. He said the room tonight was the largest turnout for a community input session in his 6 years on the council. Haley looked at the parking lot, at the last of the 237 people making their way to their cars. At the movement of a community that had been waiting, she realized, not for permission to care about this, but for confirmation that caring about it would actually go somewhere, that the caring would land in a room that was listening, that the room would be large enough to matter. They came, she said. They came, Raymond said, because you made it worth coming to. She looked at him. You made it worth coming to. All of you. Every person who showed up at that highway shoulder, every person who stayed in the community and built something instead of just getting out of its way. I just got stopped on a Tuesday afternoon. You got stopped on a Tuesday afternoon, he said, and you handled it exactly right. She thought about that for a moment, about what exactly right had cost and what it had produced, and the distance between those two things that was measured not in time or miles, but in 47 stops and 17 people in a community center on a Saturday morning and one officer in the back of a council room on a Tuesday night, and 237 people who had come because they needed to know that the room was listening. Let's go home, she said. Raymond put a hand on her shoulder for just a moment, brief, solid, the touch of a man who understood that some things didn't need to be extended to be complete. Yeah, he said, let's go home. The council vote happened on a Monday morning, 6 weeks after the parking lot conversation, and Haley found out about it the way she found out about most things these days, not from the people who were supposed to tell her, but from her phone, which buzzed at 10:23 with a message from Jerome Gates that said simply, 7-2. The quarterly review protocol is now municipal policy. Congratulations. She was in the middle of a timing chain replacement when the message came in. She read it twice. Then she set the phone on the workbench and went back to the engine. Because the engine required her hands, and the moment required her to be somewhere real and physical and demanding. Somewhere that had nothing to do with city councils or legal frameworks or the slow institutional machinery that had been grinding through its own gears for the past 6 weeks. She needed the weight of a real tool in her hand and the specific resistance of metal that didn't move unless you understood it. And for about 4 minutes, she just worked. And the timing chain went where it was supposed to go. And she breathed. Then she picked up the phone and called Dennis. He answered on the first ring, you saw. 7-2, she said. 7-2. The two no votes were procedural objections, not substantive ones. Both council members said they supported the policy, but wanted more time to review the implementation language. Gates told me privately that both of them will be yes votes on the implementation guidelines when those come up in 90 days. So functionally 9-0. Functionally 9-0. The quarterly data review is now law. Demographic breakdown is required. The supervisory review threshold is in the ordinance language. It has teeth. Haley pressed her palm flat against the workbench for a moment. Not a dramatic gesture, just a need to feel something solid. The training module? Chief confirmed this morning that the first revised session runs in 3 weeks. Carla's organization is listed as a consulting partner in the department's official documentation. Joy's curriculum is being reviewed for potential departmental endorsement as a community resource. And the liaison program? First meeting is scheduled for next month. Your father, Deke Morrison, 2 sport club representatives, Carla and 2 others from the community side. Aldous is chairing. It's on the departmental calendar as a recurring quarterly event. She was quiet for a moment. She heard him waiting. Is it enough? She asked. He was honest, because he was always honest. It's more than I've seen come out of a single incident in 15 years of this work. Whether it's enough depends on whether the people who implemented it treat it as a floor or a ceiling. Whether the quarterly reviews actually produce responses when the data triggers them. Whether the liaison meetings become real dialogue or get managed into irrelevance. He paused. But the structure is sound. You built something real. We built something real, she said. You started it. On a highway shoulder at 61 miles per hour in a 65 zone. Dennis laughed, which was something she'd only heard him do 3 times in 6 weeks. And each time it had the quality of something he wasn't used to doing in his professional context. Yes, he said. That's where it started. She called Joy next. Joy made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sharp exhale and said, I need you to know that I have a waiting list for the curriculum sessions. A waiting list. I've never had a waiting list in 6 years of running safety courses. How long? 63 people. And that's just the first 2 sessions. I've had inquiries from instructors in Tucson and Flagstaff asking if they can license the curriculum. Haley sat with that for a second. 63 people. 63 people who were going to spend a Saturday morning learning that am I being detained was a question they had the right to ask. And what happened next if they asked it? And who to call and in what order? 63 people who were going to go back to their communities and carry that knowledge the way knowledge always carried itself, not in a single direction but outward, person to person, the way things spread through networks built on trust rather than algorithms. Do they know what they're licensing? She asked. They know it started with you, Joy said. I told them. I thought it was important for them to know that this curriculum didn't come from a textbook. It came from someone who was on a highway shoulder and needed it and then decided to build it. Haley thought about that. About the difference between knowledge that came from theory and knowledge that came from the specific texture of a situation, the weight of 52 minutes on a hot shoulder with everything working the way it was supposed to work, except for the one thing that had gone wrong first. The curriculum worked because it wasn't abstract. It worked because every section of it had been shaped by someone who had stood exactly where the people in those sessions might one day stand, and who had understood from the inside out what the knowledge needed to be and what form it needed to take to actually be usable. Keep me in the loop on Tucson and Flagstaff, she said. If they want to license it, I want to be involved in the training of whoever facilitates it. The curriculum is only as good as the person explaining it. Already planned, Joy said. You're the source. You stay involved. Raymond called that afternoon. He'd heard about the vote from Aldous directly, which told Haley something about the relationship that had developed between her father and the deputy chief over the past 6 weeks, that they were in sufficient contact that Aldous had called Raymond. Before the council session was publicly announced, which was a different category of relationship than two people who met at a conference table. It was the early architecture of something that might, over time, if both of them kept showing up the way they'd been showing up, become actual trust. Aldous called you, she said. Before it was on the news, Raymond confirmed. What did he say? He said he hoped this was the beginning of a different kind of conversation between the department and the community. Then he said he'd read the curriculum. Joy is running, and he wanted to know if any of the sessions could be open to civilian employees of the department. Haley paused. Civilian employees, dispatchers, administrative staff, people who have contact with the public but aren't sworn officers. He thought the riders' rights information might be useful for them to understand from the community's side. She was quiet for a moment, turning that over. The idea that the curriculum she'd built to protect riders from bad stops might find its way into the institution itself, not as a confrontation but as a shared language. A common understanding of what the rights were and why they existed and what it felt like on both sides of them was something she hadn't anticipated. It changed the shape of what she was building in a way that took her a moment to map. What did you tell him? She asked. I said I'd ask you. She thought about it for exactly as long as it took to understand that the answer was obvious, and had been obvious the moment he said it. Tell him yes. Tell him the sessions are open. Tell him I'd like to facilitate one of them, personally. Raymond was quiet for a beat. You sure about that last part? The people in that department who aren't Keller need to know what the community experiences. And the people in the community who come to these sessions need to know that the department isn't monolithic, that there are people in it who are trying to do this right. She paused. You can't build a liaison if both sides only ever talk to each other through a mediator. At some point, you have to be in the same room learning the same thing. Raymond said, your grandfather used to say something like that. She hadn't known her grandfather, though. Well, he died when she was 11, but she'd heard his words often enough through her father that they'd become part of the furniture of her mind, things she thought in his phrases without always knowing it. What did he say? He said the only walls worth building are the ones you can see over. Everything else is just a place for fear to live. Haley didn't say anything for a moment. She just held that, felt the weight of it. Tell Aldous yes, she said, and tell him to bring whoever in that department is serious about actually changing something. Not the people who need to be seen doing the right thing. The people who want to actually do it. He'll know the difference, Raymond said. I think so too. The twist that nobody had planned for arrived on a Thursday morning in the form of a phone call from a number Haley didn't recognize, with a Nevada area code. She almost didn't answer it. She was between jobs in the shop, and her phone had been ringing more than she could reasonably manage for 6 weeks. And she'd gotten selective about unknown numbers in a way that felt like a small, reasonable self-preservation. She answered it. The woman on the other end of the line identified herself as Nora Vasquez. She was 31 years old. She was a licensed motorcycle technician in Las Vegas, Nevada. She had been stopped 4 months earlier on a Nevada highway under circumstances that she described in a brief, controlled summary that took about 90 seconds, and that tracked, in its essential structure, so precisely with what had happened to Haley on the I-17 corridor that Haley felt the hair on her arms stand up. Different highway, different state, different officer. Same stop. How did you find me? Haley asked. Marcus Webb's article, Nora said. And then the curriculum that Joy Reyes has been running. I found Joy's website, and it referenced you. I've been trying to find the right moment to call for 3 weeks. What happened with your stop? Nora told her. It had been 59 minutes. The motorcycle was hers, a modified Kawasaki Ninja she'd rebuilt herself. The plate was clean. The VIN was clean. She had every document. It- the officer had questioned how she could afford a modified bike on a mechanic's salary. He had asked about motorcycle club affiliations after noticing a patch. He had requested consent to search 4 times. She had said no 4 times. He had called for a supervisor. The supervisor had arrived and released her. No recording, no attorney, no father 40 minutes away. I didn't know what to do afterward, Nora said. I went home and I was shaking and I was angry and I felt like I'd done something wrong, which I knew wasn't right, but that's how it felt. Like I'd failed a test I should have passed. Haley recognized that feeling with the precision of something she'd carried in her own body. You didn't fail anything, she said. You said no 4 times when they asked for consent. That's 4 times you did exactly right. But I had no recording. I had no documentation. I filed a complaint and I never heard back. When did you file? 4 months ago. Haley was already reaching for a pen. I'm going to give you Dennis Park's number. He's in Phoenix, but he has contacts in Nevada. Tell him I sent you. Tell him everything you just told me. She paused. And I need to ask you something. Your stop, do you know if there's any pattern? Other riders in Nevada who've had similar experiences. There was a silence on the other end that told her everything before Nora said a word. That's actually why I really called, Nora said. Because I'm not the only one. I've been talking to other riders here, and there's at least 8 of us who've had stops that look like this in the past year. Same corridor, sometimes the same officer. I've been trying to figure out if there's enough to do something with, but I didn't know how to start. Haley set down the pen. She thought about 47 stops. She thought about the pattern that Dennis's data request had uncovered that had changed the shape of what began as a single incident into something that required a systemic response. She thought about what Carla had said, 3 years of documentation, waiting for a case that was clean enough to lead with. She thought about what it meant that the same architecture that had made her stop visible was now appearing in a different state. With 8 documented cases and a woman on the phone who had been living for 4 months with the weight of something she hadn't known how to name. Nora, she said, I want you to do something for me. Okay. I want you to write down every name of every rider you've talked to who's had a stop like yours. I want dates, locations, officer identifiers if you have them, and whatever documentation each person still has. I want you to collect all of that, and then I want you to call Dennis, and I want you to tell him that Haley Carter says, this is the next one. A long pause. The next one, Nora said. The pattern in Phoenix started with 1 stop. Yours is going to start in Nevada with 8. That's a different starting point. That's already a pattern before it gets to court. She paused. But you need documentation, and you need legal support, and you need to start building it the way I started building mine methodically, without anger driving the decisions, focused on what you want to change rather than who you want to punish. Nora was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted slightly, not the controlled neutrality she'd managed at the beginning of the call, but something more open, more present. The sound of someone who had been carrying something for months and had just been told they didn't have to anymore. I didn't know this could go anywhere, she said. I didn't either, Haley said, until I decided it had to. She told her father about the call that evening. They were at the garage behind his house, the same garage where she'd grown up handing him tools, and he was doing what he always did on Thursday evenings, working on something that didn't need to be fixed, because working on something was how he thought, and thinking was what the evenings were for. She sat on a stool and drank a Coke from the old refrigerator by the door and told him about Nora Vasquez and 8 stops and a Nevada highway and the pattern that was starting to look less like a coincidence and more like a feature. Raymond listened without interrupting, the way he always did when something important was being said. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning a wrench over in his hand without applying it to anything. You know what this means, he said. It means it's not Phoenix. It's not one department. It's something bigger. It means what you built here has to become something portable, he said. The curriculum, the documentation system, the legal network, it has to be able to travel. I know. That's a different size of project than what you started. I know that too. He looked at her. Are you ready for that? She thought about the question the way it deserved. She thought about what ready meant, not the absence of fear or uncertainty. Because she'd never operated from the absence of those things. She'd just learned not to let them be the loudest voice in the room. She thought about the 17 people in the first mess session and the 63 on the waiting list and the instructors in Tucson and Flagstaff who wanted to license the curriculum, and Nora Vasquez, who'd lived for 4 months with the weight of a stop she hadn't known how to name, and 8 riders in Nevada who were waiting for someone to tell them that what happened to them was documentable and actionable and worth fighting for. She thought about the 9-year-old in this garage asking her father what each tool did and why. I'm ready enough, she said. That's the only kind of ready that ever actually exists. Raymond put the wrench down. He looked at his daughter the way he'd looked at her since she was old enough to have an opinion worth taking seriously. Not like she needed guidance, but like she was someone worth listening to, which was the specific kind of respect that had shaped her more than any lesson he'd ever tried to teach directly. What do you need? He said. I need the chapter's communication network. Not to organize anything through the club. Officially, this has to be its own thing. But the network reaches people in ways that nothing else does. I need to be able to put information into it and have it travel. Done, he said. What else? I need an introduction to whoever Aldous knows in the Nevada law enforcement structure. If there's a departmental contact there who's the equivalent of what Bennett was here, someone inside the institution who's already looking at this problem, I need to find them before Nora's case becomes public. Raymond picked up his phone and started scrolling. Aldous knows people everywhere, he said. I'll call him tonight. Tonight? Is there a reason to wait? There wasn't. There was never a reason to wait when you knew what needed doing and you had what you needed to do it. That was the other thing her father had built into her. The thing that lived alongside the patience, the understanding that patience was a tool for the right moment, not a permanent posture, and that the right moment for patience and the right moment for action were different moments that required different readings of the situation, and that the reading was everything. No, she said. No reason to wait. 3 months later, Dennis Park flew to Las Vegas. He flew with a file that contained Nora Vasquez's documentation, 7 additional sworn statements from Nevada riders, a comparative analysis that Carla Oates had prepared showing pattern similarities between the Nevada stops and the Phoenix case, and a letter from Jerome Gates to the Las Vegas City Council describing the municipal policy framework that Phoenix had implemented and offering it as a model. He was met at the airport by a Nevada attorney named Sandra Chu, who had been practicing civil rights law for 11 years and who had been building her own version of what Carla had built in Phoenix 3 years of. Documentation waiting for a case clean enough to lead with. Nora's case was clean enough. The Nevada story ran in the Las Vegas Review-Journal 6 weeks after Dennis's trip. It cited Phoenix. It cited Haley Carter. It cited the municipal policy framework that was now 3 months into its first quarterly review cycle, which had flagged 2 officers for supervisory review based on the demographic breakdown data, flagged them, reviewed them, adjusted their field assignments, documented the process. The policy was working, not perfectly, not without friction, but working in the specific sense that it was doing the thing it had been designed to do, which was to make the pattern visible before it required a council session and 237 people in a room that was supposed to hold 200. When Haley read the Nevada article, she was in her shop. She was sitting at her workbench with her coffee going cold in the corner the way it always did, and she read the whole thing. And she read the part where Sandra Chu was quoted saying that the Phoenix framework had given them a model, and Haley Carter's documentation had given them a roadmap, and she held that for a moment. A roadmap. She thought about the highway. She thought about 61 miles per hour in a 65 zone, and the lights coming on behind her, and the 45 seconds between seeing those lights and pulling over safely and cleanly, the 45 seconds in which she had done the things she'd always done when she needed to think clearly, breathed out slow, let her shoulders drop, moved through the sequence she'd rehearsed in her head. The preparation that had happened before the moment arrived, because the preparation had to happen before the moment arrived. Or it wasn't preparation, it was just luck. She had prepared. The preparation had worked. And then she had turned the preparation into a roadmap because she understood that keeping it to herself would have been a different kind of failure than anything Keller had done to her on that shoulder, smaller in legal consequence, but larger in moral weight. The failure of someone who had what others needed and kept it anyway. Keller completed his accountability review in the same month the Nevada article ran. The review had taken 4 months. It had involved a formal interview process, a supervised ride-along program where he was partnered with a senior officer specifically to observe stop decisions in real time, a mandatory completion of the revised training module, which he had attended alongside civilian department employees, in a session facilitated partly by Haley herself, which had been the most uncomfortable room either of them had ever been in, and also, somehow, one of the most necessary, and a written reflection submitted to Internal Affairs that the department did not make public, but that Dennis had been told, through appropriate channels, was substantive rather than performative. He was not terminated. He was not promoted. He remained in his current role with a documented review on his record and a supervisory note that would follow him in any future evaluation. Whether that was justice was a question that different people answered differently depending on what they thought justice was for. Haley had said from the beginning that she wanted something structural rather than something punitive. And she'd said it because she meant it, not because it was the morally comfortable position. She'd said it because she'd grown up watching her father navigate consequences in a community where people who made mistakes still had to live alongside the people they'd wronged, and where the question of how you built something functional out of that reality was always harder and more important than the question of how much you could make someone suffer for what they'd done. She hadn't forgiven Keller. Forgiveness was a different project, and one she was doing on her own timeline, privately, without announcing its stages or its destination. What she'd done was something more practical, and in some ways more difficult. She'd decided that the thing she wanted from the situation was not revenge, but change. And she'd gone and built the change, and she'd let the revenge be someone else's project if they needed it. She'd passed him once since the council session. It was on the I-17 corridor, which she still rode every time she had reason to go north of the city, because the highway was the highway, and it was hers the same as it was everyone's. And she was not going to reorganize her life around a stretch of asphalt because of what had happened on it. She came up behind a patrol car at a merger and recognized the vehicle number and held her nose steady and passed it cleanly and didn't look over. She didn't know if he saw her. She didn't need to know. The thing that stayed with her in the months that followed past the Nevada story and the first quarterly review and the third curriculum session and the liaison meeting that Raymond described afterward as the most honest conversation he'd had with anyone in law enforcement in 30 years was something Hayes had written at the end of his internal statement. She'd read it in Dennis's office the morning he received a copy, and it had sat in her mind ever since with the specific weight of something true. He'd written, "The gap between knowing something is wrong and acting on that knowledge is not a personal moral failing. It is a structural problem. Structures that do not give people the language, the support, and the expectation to act on what they know will always produce people who knew and did nothing. Changing what people know is necessary but insufficient. We have to change what they believe is possible to do with what they know. What they believe is possible." Haley thought about that every time she stood in front of a room of riders. Every time she said, "Here's what you can say, and here's what happens next, and here's who you call." She was not just transferring information. She was expanding what people believed was possible. She was saying, with every session and every resource referral and every carefully worded explanation of consent versus compliance, that the moment on the highway shoulder was not one you had to survive by luck or by knowing the right person. That it was one you could navigate because you understood the ground you were standing on and why it was solid. that the ground had always been solid. You just had to know it. She was in her shop on a Tuesday afternoon, not a memorable Tuesday, not an anniversary of anything, just a Tuesday in late autumn, with the first real cool of the season coming through the open bay door, and a fuel injection system that needed her full attention when her phone buzzed with a message from Joy. Session 5 just ended. 18 people. One of them drove from Tucson specifically for this. She brought her 19-year-old daughter. The daughter asked better questions than anyone in the room. Haley read it, smiled at her phone, and set it back down on the workbench next to her cold coffee. She picked up her tools and went back to work. Because the work was still there, the work that had always been there, the engines and the torque specs and the precise under systems held of house it together, and what happened when you ignored the small failures before they became the kind that left you on the side of the road. She had spent her whole adult life learning that language. She was still learning it. She would be learning it for the rest of her career, because that was what a real craft demanded. Not mastery in the sense of completion, but mastery in the sense of devotion, the ongoing commitment to understanding something more deeply tomorrow than you understood it today. The same principle applied to everything she'd built in the past 4 months. The curriculum was a living document. The liaison program was in its 3rd meeting and hadn't found its final shape yet. The Nevada case was 6 weeks from filing and would require attention she was already organizing for. The training module revision had produced one strong session and needed refinement before the second. The quarterly review in Phoenix had flagged 2 officers, and the supervisory response was being watched by everyone who'd been in that council room, watched with the specific attention of people who understood that the first test of a new system determines whether it becomes a real system or stays a piece of paper. There was so much left to do. That was the part that people who heard the story from the outside sometimes missed, the part where the thing didn't end with the council vote or the newspaper article or the meeting in the parking lot. It didn't end. The highway didn't end. People were still riding it every day, all day. And the work of making sure that the next person pulled over on that highway had something solid to stand on was ongoing. Permanent. Not a project with a conclusion, but a practice with a direction. Haley understood that. She had understood it since the kitchen table 2 days after the stop, when she'd sat in the silence of her own house and decided that knowing required something. The something turned out to be larger than she'd known when she first named it, and more complicated and more dependent on other people than she'd anticipated, and slower in some places and faster in others, and in every way more real than the version she'd imagined alone at that table. Real was what she'd wanted. Real was what she'd gotten. And the red Ducati Panigale, rebuilt from the engine out, 14 months of a young woman's best work poured into a machine that was legally and mechanically, and in every measurable way, exactly what she'd always said. It sat in the bay of her shop with the afternoon light coming through the door, and it was going to be on the highway tomorrow, and the day after, and every day that Haley Carter had reason to ride north out of Phoenix with clean paperwork in the storage compartment under the seat and the full and absolute knowledge of the ground she was standing on. She knew who she was. She had always known. And now, because of a Tuesday afternoon on a highway shoulder and 52 minutes of standing exactly right, and the decision that knowing required something and that something required building, so did everyone else.